y es profesor en un departamento que es literatura comparada, aunque me parece que también has estado en Divine, ¿cómo se dice? Divine School. Divinity School. Pero bueno, ya sabéis que en los departamentos de filosofía de América generalmente no hay filosofía continental. La filosofía continental se hace en los departamentos de alemán, literatura comparada, ¿no? Porque en los departamentos de filosofía se hace filosofía analítica generalmente, ¿no? O sea que en muchos departamentos de German o French hay muchos filósofos, ¿no? Y también en los departamentos de literatura comparada, ¿no? Hay mucha gente que hace pues, literatura, filosofía, etc., ¿no? Bueno, entonces, efectivamente tenemos ante nosotros un perfil muy interdisciplinar, con filósofo, con un conocimiento magnífico de la literatura, que ha publicado en muy distintos ámbitos. La verdad es que no hay casi editoriales de las apetecibles para nosotros en que William Franke no haya publicado. Tenemos Chicago, tenemos varios Cambridge, tenemos Notre Dame, tenemos Rowledge, tenemos Bloomsbury, tenemos bueno, realmente es impresionante, ¿no? La cantidad de lugares donde el profesor Franke ha publicado. Podríamos decir que es uno de los expertos internacionales en el pensamiento, o sea, en la investigación sobre Dante. Tiene varios libros, por ejemplo, Dante's Interpretative Journey o Dantologies, Theoretical and Theological Perspectives of the Theological Turn, más o menos, no es exacto el título, pero luego también tenemos Philosophy of the Unsayable, que es toda la parte, que no está desconectado de la interpretación de Dante, pero que sí que es cierto que luego también el profesor Franke ha seguido de un modo increíble toda la tradición de la teología negativa, pensamiento apofático, y de hecho tiene 2 volúmenes en los que va repasando, por decir así, lo que considera pensamiento apofático en la tradición filosófica, ¿no? Que es estos volúmenes de, a ver, ayúdame, William, on That Cannot Be Said, On What Cannot Be Said, y bueno, y luego también tiene algunos libros que son sobre cuestiones políticas o sobre cuestiones de pensamiento crítico, bueno, en fin, que es muy amplio el ámbito al que se ha dedicado. Pero la historia de nuestro seminario de hoy es una historia muy bonita, y es que hace varios años, el año 20, ¿no? Antes de la pandemia, 19-20, ¿no? Este curso, pues invitamos a una estancia de movilidad del profesor Franke y estuvo aquí impartiendo una asignatura sobre el Quijote. Porque una de las asignaturas que imparte en su universidad es Great Books, ¿no? Yeah. Sí, bueno, luego tú me corriges todo, pero bueno, sé mucho de ti, pero no todo. Claro.
Hemos leído, hay los estudiantes, algunos que ahora hacen el doctorado, hemos hecho Dante, la vida nueva, y Hamleto y el Quijote. Para mí, Quijote fue nuevo, la primera vez.
Exacto, como los grandes profesores de universidad, cuando hacen un curso, se lo toman muy en serio. Y entonces publican un libro. Entonces, pues igual que hacía pues eso, ¿no? Michel Foucault o otras personas, cuando hacen un curso, cuando el curso es nuevo, no lo han hecho nunca, es la primera vez, pues entonces se lo toman muy en serio. Entonces el profesor Franke, cuando estuvo aquí, estuvo investigando sobre la cuestión del Quijote, y entonces pues publicó este libro en Rowledge, Don Quixote's Impossible Quest for the Absolute in Literature, Fiction, Reflection and Negative Theology, que es una de sus. Y aquí nosotros podemos encontrar que el profesor Franke, en las primeras páginas, cuando habla de los agradecimientos, pues cita a los aquí presentes. A ver, ahora no la voy a encontrar, pero yo creo que sí. Aquí está. I thank also my students in the Great Works course that I was privileged to teach, particularly Nicolás de Navascués, Javier Viñeta, Miquel Martínez, María Sáenz Marcos, Carmen Pérez San Martín, que no están aquí. Entonces, fijaos qué casualidad que estos alumnos están aquí hoy en su doctorado, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, yo estoy muy agradecida también al profesor Franke, que no se ahorre jamás en los prólogos de sus libros la referencia a la Universidad de Navarra, a este trabajo que tenemos común, que ha nacido bastante en el seno de la facultad, pero también en el seno del grupo de investigación de Religion and Civil Society. Y hoy tenemos la suerte de poder como presentar este libro aquí y también de tener de discussant a nuestro especialista en filosofía española, ¿no? Filosofía que ya sabemos que no le gusta a Alejandro de filosofía española, que le gusta filosofía contemporánea, los españoles. Pero bueno, esto, y nada, y os doy la palabra para que procedáis. Muchas gracias por estar aquí, William, y volver a compartir con nosotros pues, tus ideas y tus textos.
No, c'est moi qui vous remercie. Yeah, really,
Don't speak French.
What you make me realize, and I hadn't had this in mind, I owe this book entirely to the invitation to this university, which is, it was a very different experience. I've been in a lot of universities from East Asia, you know,
Sí, es verdad, no he comentado que también es profesor en Macao.
Yeah, through various hemispheres. And this university really does have something very special, I think, especially for studies in the humanities and with the theological connection, which is so important for me as well, personally. So we were really thriving, I felt, in 2020, and of course then COVID struck and the university closed in the middle of the semester. And we finished then by internet from France. And nevertheless, the whole experience really did pan out in all of these ways. And what a pleasure really to see the students from all those years ago now doing their doctorates. So really it's eminently appropriate to have this session on this book, which, as Professor Gerardo's remarks bring out, it's on Don Quixote, but it is an application of my thinking of what cannot be said, the philosophy of the unsayable, which does come to a considerable degree to me from Dante, the ineffability in the Paradiso of Dante, and there were some other books on that subject, but taking Dante as really the midpoint of the whole tradition of ancient, both the ancient classics and the biblical tradition, really all culminating in Dante, but then poets since Dante, in some way or other, repeating some aspect of the Divine Comedy. So I thought I would actually contextualize my approach here to Don Quixote within this broader perspective. This is the book, The Revelation of Imagination, from Homer and the Bible, through Virgil and Augustine, to Dante. Right? That's the tradition leading up to Dante, in which I'm treating the tradition of prophetic poetry as a kind of religious revelation. That really is the thesis that I pursue in myriad works. It's I consider myself to be a literary thinker as well as a theological thinker, and they all, and philosophical, of course, they all coalesce. And having really concentrated very much on this high tradition of prophetic poetry, right? The divine word revealed then in human words of creative poetic imagination. And I should say, I follow that through then beyond Dante, that same line of thought and tradition into secular scriptures, modern theological poetics in the wake of Dante, Milton, Blake, and numerous others. I'm trying to really, up to our own postmodern times, ways in which we're all repeating some part of Dante, still in this tradition of prophetic poetry as theological revelation. Now, I wanted to take up another tradition. I had this idea for some time, having concentrated on these texts. I was aware that there's another tradition, moving from ancient comedy Menippean satire, Apuleius, the Golden Ass, through the medieval age, especially with Boccaccio, Chaucer, comedy, comedy, satire, the parodic, picaresque tradition of literature. It goes through Ovid as well, up to Rabelais, James Joyce. I wanted really to engage this great tradition of literature as well, also as a form of revelation, and even I go so far as to make it theological revelation. The working title of this book, and I think this started really in the semester here in Navarra, was Meta-Theological Meditations on Don Quixote. And I worked with that title all the way through. Of course, publishers, they have their own ideas about how to sell books, but I like this. I came up with this title then as well, which I think is probably best for the book. But nevertheless, it really is, for me, still meta-theological meditations, like the Meditaciones del Quixote, the famous book by Ortega, and that really is my model. I think I know that Alejandro sees me as being very close to Unamuno, and that's true, but for me, not less so to Ortega. In many ways, it's Ortega's work that I admired the most on Quixote. So I did want to set up this parallel, and we're moving here into a different kind of revelation, theological revelation through laughter. Right? This is the tradition of literature producing laughter, and laughter being a way of turning the world upside down, seeing it as you've never seen it before in those authors, Rabelais and the rest that I mentioned. It becomes an apocalyptic revelation through laughter. And this is where I situate Cervantes' Don Quixote. And the first chapter here is on Cervantes' Christian comic muse. It's tragicomic. One speaks of laughter at the foot of the cross as well. There could be something rather sacrilegious about that, but it's not meant that way. There is an element of laughter in the most serious of events and the discourses. Part of this tradition, the Encomium Moriae, in praise of folly, Erasmus articulates some of this Christian spirit, which is comic, right? Comedic. The Divine Comedy tells you that as well. That Christianity really does open to comedy in a way that the tragic world didn't. The ancient world, in some ways, is really tragic. And there's a reversal that Dante certainly announces, and I think it's playing through this genealogy or descent that we can trace through Cervantes into modern times. Quixote becomes such a crucial figure for Dostoevsky, for Kierkegaard, for Fielding, his Joseph Andrews, Graham Greene. There's an interesting book by Eric Ziolkowski, The Sanctification of Don Quixote, by these modern authors. So, actually, just to reinforce this point, I want to read a few excerpts. Here's the first. Comedy can be serious business as a way of interrogating human existence in its perennial search for lasting significance. Humor and drollery afford surprisingly elevated vantage points for contemplating fundamental principles of socio-ethical life and cosmic order, bordering on an opening to the fathomless mystery of existence. Laughter can be cognitively powerful in clearing a space for certain types of unprejudiced and penetrating vision into ordinarily unseen or overlooked levels of reality. Comedy can reach deep into the wellspring of life and its meaning, whether cultural, cosmic, or personal. Our classic current of comic literature in poetry, fiction, and drama distinguishes itself by its sublime revelation of our pathetically vulnerable human condition. It attains to august peaks in well-known and sometimes popular works by canonical authors such as the ones that I mentioned. Now, my angle of approach in this context is especially through philosophical readers, and particularly Unamuno and Ortega, right? These two amazing poles, really, of Spanish philosophical thinking early in the 20th century. Both of their interpretations I find so compelling, not only as interpretations of the Quixote, but of life, of existence. And of course, the Spanish character is crucial to them. You know, what is it to be Spanish? And Don Quixote becomes an icon. They really focus on Don Quixote as the fundamental figure for their philosophies in general, and for their interpretations of the soul of the Spanish nation. What is so incomparably compelling about the character of Don Quixote, I think, hangs together with the absolutization of subjectivity. Right? This is a modern work, early modern work. It's really a threshold, the cusp of modernity, we might say. And there is a discovery of subjectivity in this book that is epic-making in some crucial ways. Now, I think they understand it rather differently. You know, Unamuno, he emphasizes in Don Quixote the unconditioned affirmation of the immortality of the soul, and this desire that, according to Unamuno, in deep psychology, we all want to live forever. It's our deepest desire. The preservation, eternally, infinitely, of our subjective being. Ortega gives us quite a different take, but I think it does all hinge still on subjectivity. And you know, Ortega, I believe his teacher in Germany was Hermann Cohen, the wonderful Kantian thinker. And you know, Kant is of course one of the watersheds for the modern subject as well. And you know, thinking, you know, how the whole world really is structured by, you know, the pure intuitions, the concepts of the understanding, and our intuitions of space and time. There's the subject is there really at the very origins of the world in Kant. Now, I want to take this back further into the Middle Ages, the status of the subject as really opening the modern era, this self-reflexivity of the subject. I want to go back to Duns Scotus, and actually I think Ortega is heavily indebted to Duns Scotus, to scholasticism, but in particular, Scotus is the one who opens a vista for a new scientific worldview. He does this theologically. It's a theological innovation that paves the way and makes science possible in the Western world. It happens really because of a theological breakthrough, which Scotus calls the univocity of being. And it is I'm going to link it to the new status of the subject. To say the univocity of being, and this is, it's actually now a departure from the analogia entis, right, the analogy of being of Thomas Aquinas, where we were able to understand something about God analogically, right? The Creator is present in all of creation, and so somehow or other, you know, we don't have a univocal knowledge of God in concepts, but we get some inkling and some notion, you know, with proportioned the problem is there is no proportion between the infinite and the finite. This is the problem that Don Quixote will pick up on. He's not the first, but he did think it systematically through to this doctrine of the univocity of being. He says, no, being is not thought in many ways. Right? That was Aristotle that Aquinas based his Analogias Entis on. No, actually, being is univocal, whether it's divine being or human being, infinite being or finite being. If we're going to have any intelligibility whatsoever, we have to say that it's the concept is univocal. However, what he further does is to admit that we do not understand God's being. And yet, he wants to insist that being, we do understand what being is. We understand it on the basis of our experience in the finite world. And this is really the charter for modern science, that we can know being, right? We don't have to always say, well, our being is not real being, it's not true being, right, Plato. The true being is up there somewhere. Scotus says, well, we don't even know analogically about what being might be apart from our experience. So he bases his metaphysics on finite being that we do know and experience. And he says that this is the only sense of being that is intelligible to us. Now, of course, he does then allow for divine revelation. Okay, God does reveal in Scripture practical precepts that are necessary for us to be able to live. But our knowledge is grounded in the being that we can understand. This opens up a kind of a gap now. And I do think that the modern, of course, Occam builds on Duns Scotus, and the Franciscan currents from there really do, Bacon, right? Roger Bacon, not Francis, but Roger Bacon, another Franciscan, they really do inaugurate the modern scientific paradigm. And I maybe didn't mention, Scotus is born 1265. He's an exact contemporary of Dante's. Dante is born 1265 as well. And the importance of that for me is that we get a kind of a negative theology that is peculiarly adapted to modern times of self-reflective subjectivity. I worked this out poetically following Dante, and then we can work it out scientifically following Duns Scotus. If we think about what kind of knowledge science offers us, we think of it as being objective, right? It's the empirical facts out there in the world. But it's always inframed by human subjectivity, by some kind of a conceptual language, right? Every science is an abstraction from the real, and that abstraction is made by human subjectivity. And I think that this is the predicament that Don Quixote is living out, with a kind of absolutization of his subjectivity, and that becomes very evident in Unamuno's interpretation. Ortega is going to point us a different direction, and this is going to come out. What I want to do here is actually allude to each of the chapters here of this book. I'm going to show you the contents. So, I already mentioned here this chapter 1, the revelation of laughter, Cervantes' comic Christian muse, and this issue of self-reflective dynamics of revelation in literature is crucial all along. You think about, even just the author, Cervantes, right? The self-reflexivity that's going on. He invents himself as, you know, the author that he attributes the manuscript to, that he discovers in a market. He attributes it to an Arab author, right? This alienating culturally his own work, right? So he becomes already a reflexive composite, and of course then, you know, Don Quixote himself, and the, I don't know, you think of the Caballero de los Espejos, the Knight of Mirrors, and in a way every character is mirroring Don Quixote. It's, you know, it's all a hall of mirrors. This self-reflexive dynamic then really does run throughout the whole book. And it's important that we discover in the modern age this new form of the novel. The novel is a wide open form. It doesn't have prescribed rules the way, you know, ancient lyric and epic and drama. This is the way it's understood by the interpreters of Don Quixote. Don Quixote is the first modern novel, and it contains everything written. The famous Latin American Peruvian author, yeah, Martínez Marquez, no. Sí. No, it says Colombiano. Yeah, everything in the modern novel is already contained here in the Quixote. It's a form that is amorphous, and it takes on all forms and rolls them into the, you know, it's epic, it's lyrical, there are many lyrical passages, it's very dramatic, and all of the dialogue. I think it's a sort of a formless form, and, you know, this is part of my argument about the nature of the novel. It becomes also a negative theological vehicle. I want to claim to be following the interpretations of both Unamuno and Ortega in reconfiguring them as approaches to reading Don Quixote as negative theology, as pointing us toward the absolute and unrevealable. Now, of course, you know, Don Quixote is this impossible quest, and we see him in his ideal. He has this, you know, this attachment, this determination to realize this ideal. We see him constantly, we could say, fail. Does he fail? To the extent that, you know, he picks himself up and goes at it again, it's all just more stimulation for him. I think that this links also with a kind of Baroque aesthetic, which we might think of as being, you know, open to infinity. Think of the, you know, the lines of the architecture. This personage of Don Quixote is so compelling to us because of the absoluteness, really, of his belief in his own subjectivity. However, it has to be more than that. It's because, you know, that would just reduce to narcissism. He is attached to an absolute that really goes beyond himself, and that's what makes him so absolutely, you know, irrefutable, and you cannot discourage him. Although there's obviously development. This is the original form of the figura of Quixote. I do think, and, you know, that part two. This book is actually about part two of the Quixote, I should say, where we see the messianic role shift from Don Quixote to Sancho Panza, the common man. And Don Quixote does himself fall into a kind of melancholia as Ortega brings out in this piece of the El Escorial that Alejandro brought to my attention, actually, or at least brought out the importance of. But it really is common to all of us, I think, the potential that is manifest in Don Quixote, and that's what is brought out. When you think of what happens to Sancho, it's really his body that suffers, right? He has to take the lashes and the pinches. He becomes the suffering messianic body, the passion, and this is one of the passion of Sancho Panza and the death of Don Quixote. Actually, maybe I should have said the death of Alonso Quijano. He's the one who dies. Don Quixote, as an archetype, lives on eternally and is re-embodied, reincarnated by Sancho Panza, who says, "Master, no, get up. Our next adventure, get up." This is, the last scene when he's dying. Sancho Panza is the one who believes in the end and in the continuation, and he's the one who has taken on the messianic role, actually, suffering for this ideal. Now, I want to, I still need to clarify, in the ways in which this is a political novel and a negative theology. I think the important point here, and then I want to come back to, the visionary in Don Quixote and in Sancho, and also in Altisidora. The book is, part 2 of the book is punctuated by crucial visionary moments. But the key, I think, to understanding why this is negative theology is that there is the puncture of the fiction by an outside. And this is why Cervantes anticipates everything in the novel. It can be weaving of a myth, and it is that. And the network of representations, and he's a master of that. But there's always the confrontation with external reality. Don Quixote's ideal, right, is undermined. It slaps him in the face every time, right from the windmills, right? He goes to attack those gigantes, dice Pancho. And so he is crushed by these windmills, maybe a symbol of the Industrial Revolution already, that Don Quixote is heroically fighting against. The important point for me here is the invasion of the external reality. This goes all the way through. When we talk about it as a political novel, you have a polarity between Barateria, the utopia on the island, right, where Sancho Panza is the governor, and he gets all the precepts about utopia from Don Quixote. That's one pole. The other pole is the emerging modern bourgeoisie, right? Not the aristocratic ambience of the dukes, and that Don Quixote represents chivalry and all, but a new crass world, the nouveau riche, Barcelona, and the dynamic, dynamic, bustling city. This is another kind of external reality that invades the fiction. You have reference to external history with the expulsions of Jews and Muslims. Ricote is one of these figures who comes back and meets Sancho, his former neighbor. You have Guinar, Roque Guinar, the robber bandit, and the society of robbers. These are contemporary realities. Cervantes is always engaging with contemporary realities, which really they're external to the fiction, and there's a friction, we might say, that he brings out beautifully in order to show us the limits of fiction and representation. And that's where you open into another realm. it's a metaphysical realm when it is projected through fiction. You could say, well, it's just the ordinary reality of history and society, and it's presented as being banal reality, right? What are people eating? What are they wearing? And this is the novelistic spirit. And yet, that external reality, when it is funneled through the fiction, it's projected on the other side into what I then want to consider not just a myth. Because of the self-reflective confrontation with externality, which cannot be represented, which really evades representation. Of course, we have historical representation. We can do all sorts of representation, but there is an absolutely radical critique of representation by fiction. We see that all of our representations, everything that pretends to be history, it all is dismantled, undermined. Cervantes shows it as fictive in origin. And so we're faced then with reality as unrepresentable. And I think that both Ortega and Unamuno have a very powerful sense of how this figure, this fiction, confront us with the enigma of a reality that is transcendent. They do it in very different ways. And of course, for Unamuno, there's a kind of irrationalism, the incomprehensible, this desire, and the will. Without intelligence, he says Don Quixote is not really very intelligent. In this piece, El Escorial, I think it's really all pretty much absorbed into the Meditaciones, but he does make that point. Ortega, I think, gives us a metaphysical, I'll try to wind up here, does also give us a metaphysical vision. It's where everything in the world exposes its limit, filtered through fiction. Things are all related to one another. I need to read, I think, something from Ortega. I have a few things marked here. Fiction is able to represent the reality surrounding it, and thereby to overcome its merely inert materiality by raising it instead to the status of a poetic theme. This elevation of the empirically real is what Cervantes' unprecedented novelistic realism succeeds in accomplishing. Ordinary reality itself is contextualized, framed, set in relation to something open to interpretation, something free and evolving. Fiction effects thereby an earth-shattering destabilization and etherealization of what we take to be ordinary reality. And this is Ortega, or this is what I'm hearing out of Ortega. A fiction is constituted by a suspension of disbelief that is a kind of double negation of the negation inherent in disbelieving. Cervantes pursues this logic a turn of the screw further in what amounts to a suspending of the suspension of disbelief that is constitutive of fiction. He suspends the suspension so that disbelief itself is inscribed into the fiction. No longer standing outside, disbelief too becomes part of the fiction. All of the characters, even those who are very skeptical, they are woven into the fiction. They become believers in Don Quixote himself. But actually the scene that the two philosophical authors concentrate on is Maese Pedro, his puppet show. And this is where Don Quixote stands up, right? Melisandra and Guayferos. There's a drama, and Quixote takes it as real, right? It's being staged before him, but he jumps on the stage and he starts slaughtering the puppets. So there's an actual invasion, from the real world into the fictive world, destroying the fictive world. And of course, it's Don Quixote's own fiction that has, that makes him behave this way. The fictions that Don Quixote imagines, and we all do this actually, become our reality, right? We act according to them as a consequence, and we make them reality. And I wanted to, then, I think I do have to contrast Don Quixote's vision in the Cave of Montesinos, which is, it's preposterous, and it all feeds into his ideas about himself. That he's been awaited as a savior to disenchant Belerma and the figures from knight errantry that are being held captive under a spell by Merlin. He's awaited. And he has this vision. Sancho is skeptical, but he was only there for half an hour. But it was several days long for him. It's the way in which he lives this out that makes it a true revelation for him. Sancho has a vision on the horse Clavileño. He sees the 7 she-goats, right? The Pleiades, right, in heaven. And he says, well, what color were they? And so he does give the colors. As if that would be the proof. But if you can tell me what color the she-goats were, then you must have really seen them, right? Fiction validates itself by more and more fiction. And Sancho's motives are not the same as Don Quixote's, even though, as I say, these characters, they actually do interpenetrate, and they end up reversing their positions. He starts, right, he has all of the common self-interestedness. He wants money, but all of that too is part of what then does make him become noble. Nevertheless, his vision has a very different kind of authenticity and a lesser degree of authenticity. You get to Altisidora's vision in hell of the devils sort of playing polo, right? Hitting balls that turn out to be books. She invents all of this when Sancho asks, "Oh, you were, she had a near-death experience. Well, what did you see when you were in hell?" On the spur of the moment, it's amazing what she comes up with. And that too is our imaginations work that way, and you can see everything about her world as a servant in an aristocratic world. They're in tuxedos. These are a modern vision of devils. It's like Mephistopheles. They're super sophisticated. Of course, our visions of the other world are reflections of ourselves. That makes them preposterous, absurd. Does it make them merely illusions, or does it make them revelations of something about us? And it can be something more frivolous, superficial, and maybe unflattering, or it can be something also very deeply bonded with our integrity as human beings. And I think Don Quixote offers us that kind of a possibility. So it's
Alejandro, tienes ahora la palabra, luego a media hay que terminar, te lo digo para si queremos luego dejarlo.
Sí, yo voy a hacer un muy breve comentario inicial y luego iré planteando algunas cuestiones para discutir, porque realmente no solo, por supuesto, el Quijote ofrece mucho material de discusión y de reflexión, sino que además este libro de Franke y toda esta aproximación que hace, es tremendamente brillante y rica. Es difícil resumir. Él ha intentado presentar las líneas fundamentales, pero realmente
fue muy difícil.
Pero realmente es muy difícil resumir todo lo que plantea en este libro, porque además es un acercamiento realmente interesante y original. Es muy especulativo, muy filosófico, pero a la vez muy apegado al texto. Es decir, se centra en la segunda parte del Quijote, que es más paródica, es más cómica, es más satírica, más autorreflexiva y más llena de menciones metaliterarias, en donde el juego es mucho mayor y de hecho es mucho más cómica y es más... y realmente esta aproximación de Franke se centra mucho en escenas concretas, comenta personajes, símbolos, matices, o sea, realmente es un comentario muy cercano, muy apegado al texto de Cervantes, que se ve que conoce muy bien, y a la vez con digamos, altos vuelos especulativos, conectando con los grandes temas de la filosofía, de la modernidad del barroco, pero más allá. Y de hecho creo que uno de los grandes méritos es que conecta muy bien con problemas actuales, tanto sociales, políticos, como filosóficos. O sea, realmente da para discutir mucho. Y la lectura vale la pena, o sea, yo eso os lo recomiendo. Antes de pasar a las cuestiones para discutir, yo sí que quería centrarme, digamos, filosóficamente en el hilo fundamental que yo creo, en mi lectura, gobierna este libro, que es la cuestión de la autorreflexividad, como gran tema que se desarrolla especialmente de un modo nuevo en los inicios de la modernidad y que al final Quijote de Cervantes es una de las grandes obras de la modernidad temprana. Y William entiende la autorreflexividad como un camino hacia la dimensión de lo infinito, de lo absoluto, de lo totalmente otro, incluso en términos, ayer lo mencionaba, de Levinas, ¿no? Es decir, la autorreflexividad es lo que nos abre o lo que nos hace experimentar el carácter experimental, sapiencial, de lo irrepresentable y lo inapropiable, o sea, lo que se nos escapa de las manos y lo que se nos escapa de las palabras, ¿no? Lo que está ahí, pero que no se puede tematizar, objetivizar, ¿no? La autorreflexividad como un camino de conocimiento y como un camino de apertura. Y además constantemente está hablando de la complejidad o del potencial incluso liberador de la autorreflexividad, ¿no? La autorreflexividad, la autorreflexión, bueno, en castellano se suele hablar de reflexividad o reflexión a secas, pero bueno, él menciona para incidir en que es, digamos, acerca de uno mismo, ¿no? La reflexividad, la autorreflexividad, como un juego, como una elevación, como una superación de la realidad fáctica, ¿no? De la realidad concreta, con sus límites, con sus estrecheces, la realidad dada, representable, expresable y con sus límites. La autorreflexividad lo presenta como un juego liberador respecto de la realidad dada, de la realidad fáctica, de los límites. De alguna manera, en la autorreflexividad, por ese juego liberador, de alguna manera ofrece una manifestación o se abre a la experiencia de una revelación, de una manifestación de una realidad más allá, que sigue siendo real, pero que ya es abierta, no es fáctica, no está meramente dada, es indeterminada. Se abre al ámbito de lo posible, de lo que es creado y recreado, y no de lo meramente dado, fáctico, con límites establecidos. Y de alguna manera está apuntando constantemente la autorreflexividad al poder creador de la subjetividad y al poder, en ese sentido, de la ficción y de la invención. Un poder liberador, un poder que amplía la realidad y que rompe los límites, rompe lo dado, rompe lo fáctico, ¿no? Si recordamos, ¿no? el primer Heidegger, que habla de la facticidad, de alguna manera la autorreflexividad, tal como se presenta en el Quijote, es romper la facticidad. Jugar con la facticidad, no hay límites, no hay facticidad, es algo mucho más allá, ¿no? Por eso esa autorreflexividad difumina las líneas entre subjetividad y realidad, va más allá de la subjetividad y va más allá de la realidad, ¿no? Difuminando, jugando, rompiendo límites, rompiendo determinaciones. De alguna manera es una ampliación de la subjetividad, porque ya no aparece tan clara la distinción entre subjetividad y realidad, pero a la vez trasciende la mera subjetividad. También siempre la complejidad y la ambivalencia, luego volveré, ¿no? Y siempre subrayando la autorreflexividad que aparece en el Quijote es peculiar porque se hace siempre a través de los ojos de la parodia, del humor, ¿no? Que Franke, yo creo que William lo señala muy bien, ese potencial especial liberador y revelador de la parodia y del humor, ¿no? Que es un decir sin decir. Y sobre todo eso, y es lo que apunta William, y por eso yo le decía que se parece más a Unamuno que a Ortega, a lo que apunta todo, es que nos abre a la dimensión de lo ideal, a la dimensión necesaria, inspiradora de lo ideal, de lo infinito, de lo absoluto, ¿no? Digamos, el contrapunto crítico inspirador respecto de lo dado. Es decir, es una liberación de lo dado, de lo fáctico, de lo que los limita, y precisamente nos abre a esa dimensión necesaria, humana, de lo infinito, de lo ideal, de lo absoluto, de lo que nunca alcanzamos pero siempre nos mueve, ¿no? Y de aquello que es aquello a lo que aspira el ser humano con esa aspiración al infinito a través de la autorreflexión, a través de la libertad. Esta sería como, a mí me parece que es como el hilo conductor, ¿no? El camino de la autorreflexividad como liberación de lo dado, de lo fáctico, y la apertura hacia lo infinito, hacia lo ideal, hacia lo absoluto. Ahora bien, por supuesto, da para discutir muchas cosas. Yo tenía varias cuestiones críticas para plantear. Uno de los méritos que me parece de William en este libro es que no simplifica los problemas, no cae en soluciones unilaterales, sino que siempre juega con la ambivalencia, con las dobles vertientes, y de hecho subraya muy bien, y yo creo que en eso es un acierto para no perder la gran riqueza y complejidad, subraya siempre el carácter dialéctico, tanto de la figura del Quijote, del personaje, como del libro, ¿no? Siempre es un sí pero no, se plantea una cosa con su contrapunto. De hecho es interesante porque ahora no lo ha subrayado tanto, pero en el libro sí que aparece, sí que lo menciona muy directamente, aquí lo ha mencionado con Unamuno y Ortega. Él habla de las dos grandes corrientes interpretativas del Quijote desde el punto de vista filosófico en sentido amplio. Digamos, la interpretación pro-Quijote, de carácter más religioso, el ideal, ¿no? el heroísmo, la aventura, el carácter inspirador del Quijote, ¿no? A favor del Quijote, o en términos de Unamuno Cervantes, ¿no? Es contra Cervantes a favor del Quijote, y la línea más, digamos, desmitificadora, secular, donde aparece el Quijote como un contraejemplo o una contrafigura de la locura, de la desmesura, de lo que hay que evitar, ¿no? Una lectura más cervantista en términos de Unamuno Ortega y menos quijotesca. Y de hecho es interesante, ¿no? Hay Unamuno y Ortega. Aunque Unamuno empezó con una lectura más cervantista en torno al casticismo, ¿no? En su época más positivista, cuando habla en un momento dado de que hay que matar al Quijote y para que venga Alonso Quijano el bueno, ¿no? Esa persona que está en la realidad. Luego él cambia radicalmente, ¿no? En su giro a partir del 97, etcétera, y ya es una apuesta decidida por el Quijote. De Ortega, por cierto, ha mencionado a Germán Cohen, ¿no? El maestro neocantiano que tuvo en Marburgo, que de hecho Cohen leyó el Quijote por insistencia a Ortega. Cohen no lo había leído y Ortega le insistió en que lo leyera y quedaron varias veces en su casa para discutirlo. Y una cosa que le asombró a Cohen es que el término alemán que se utilizaba para traducir hazaña es Tathandlung, que es un término fundamental en Fichte. Y de hecho, Ortega siempre ve al Quijote desde los ojos de Fichte en la interpretación. También hay que recordar que Meditaciones del Quijote, o sea, el actual libro conocido como Meditaciones del Quijote, en realidad es la primera parte de Meditaciones del Quijote. Era un preámbulo metodológico donde no habla del Quijote y que anunciaba la segunda parte, que era sobre el Quijote. De hecho, incluso se anunció, estuvo en folletos, se anunciaba la venta de la parte de Meditaciones del Quijote donde se habla del Quijote, que de hecho Ortega nunca escribió, y donde hablaba del Quijote es precisamente eso, lo que menciona Meditaciones del Escorial, ¿no? Donde hace esa crítica a la figura quijotesca. Entonces, hay una cuestión interesante que lo que plantea la interpretación de Unamuno, con la que conecta un poco William, es la primacía de la fe, la primacía de la voluntad, la primacía de la subjetividad creadora frente a toda facticidad, ¿no? Creamos el ideal, nos creamos a nosotros mismos y de alguna manera la ficción es una manera de ampliar nuestra realidad y tener más o menos el control. De hecho, es la frase famosa del Quijote, ¿no? Yo soy quien quiero ser, ¿no? Nosotros somos nuestras ficciones, ¿no? Nosotros somos aquello que nos creamos y nuestra realidad es la realidad que nosotros nos creamos, ¿no? Es ese carácter creador de la ficción, ¿no? Digamos, desmaterializador, deslimitador, de que nos rompe, o sea, genera una concepción mucho más problemática, bueno, mucho más compleja, mucho más moldeable de la materialidad, que conecta muy bien, y lo he mencionado varias veces, con nuestra actual sociedad con el peso de lo digital, del mundo digital, de las redes sociales, donde nosotros creamos la realidad en la que vivimos, ¿no? Y nosotros nos creamos nos creamos a nosotros mismos de alguna manera, porque nuestras ficciones son inseparables. Y de hecho, como aparece en el Fausto, ¿no? Las ficciones que creamos nos acaban esclavizando, ¿no? Somos esclavos de las ficciones que creamos. Cosa que conecta muy bien con la realidad, ¿no? Claro, ahí el problema es hasta qué punto el peligro de perder la realidad. El peligro de difuminamos los límites, por lo tanto acaban desapareciendo los límites. Y claro, es llamativo que de alguna manera la plena autoconciencia del Quijote, la recuperación de la lucidez, de alguna manera tiene que ver con enterrar a Don Quijote. Es una conciencia recobrada. La conciencia recobrada es más conciencia que la conciencia original, ¿no? Eso no es un genio, ¿no? Hay que pasar por ese extrañamiento, por la locura, para llegar a la conciencia recobrada. Pero una conciencia recobrada es una conciencia que abandona o que tiene solo la experiencia del desengaño. De alguna manera deja la idea detrás. Y también es interesante por la crítica que hace Ortega, ¿no? Al final creamos ficciones, pero no creamos nada. No creamos nada duradero, no creamos nada, digamos, que reporte de verdad a los demás, que reporte un bien para los demás. A la vez, en el acercamiento de William, eso queda contrapesado, porque ¿cuáles son los contrapesos? La realidad se difumina, los límites entre la realidad y la subjetividad se difuminan, cosa que es real, porque es cierto que es artificial poner límites y fronteras abstractas, o fronteras rígidas, mejor dicho, pero a la vez está el peligro de difuminar tanto que se pierda el papel de la realidad, que vivamos en un mundo totalmente ficcionalizado, en el fondo caigamos en el narcisismo, que es un peligro que le advierto, ¿no? Jugar con los límites sin difuminar, y de hecho me parece interesante el contrapunto que aparece, que señala William varias veces, que en la propia novela, en la propia labor de Cervantes, a pesar de ese difuminar los límites, incluso de los géneros, por ejemplo, hombres que se presentan como mujeres, mujeres que se presentan como hombres, o sea, todo muy contemporáneo, de alguna manera surgen como contrapuntos del narcisismo, del peligro del narcisismo, como contrapuntos al proyecto quijotesco llevado al extremo, aparece la comunidad, el amigo, el diálogo, ¿no? Menciona en el prólogo que escribe Cervantes la presencia del amigo, del otro, la necesidad del diálogo de la comunidad para no perdernos en nosotros mismos, en, digamos, un puro narcisismo solipsista, etcétera. Por otro lado, también subraya William que siempre la realidad se acaba imponiendo, por eso la importancia de los procesos de desengaño. Al final, ¿no? Los molinos son gigantes, pero nos chocamos contra las astas. Al final, ¿no? El retablo de Maese Pedro que ha mencionado es una batalla, un conflicto real, pero realmente acabamos rompiendo y nos encontramos con el material de las marionetas, ¿no? Al final, la realidad triunfa, la realidad siempre se impone. También ese carácter de desengaño y de ridículo del Quijote, o sea, ese contrapeso, ¿no? Y por eso también subraya muy bien William, de manera muy brillante, la fuerte materialidad del Quijote. O sea, todas las descripciones sensibles, materiales, o sea, es tremendamente visual y material, llena de olores, sabores, colores, ¿no? La materialidad está muy, muy, muy presente. Por eso Don Quijote siempre es una figura tan ambivalente. O sea, es un ideal y es un contraideal a la vez. Entonces, esa ambivalencia, esa doble vertiente, los límites entre subjetividad y realidad se difuminan para ampliarlos, pero a la vez no se pierden del todo. Entonces, eso me parece realmente brillante y muy bien llevado, y es un tema para discutir, ¿no? Hasta qué punto, o sea, realmente, hasta qué punto es inspirador el Quijote o simplemente es aleccionador, como un ideal interesante, pero que se le va de la mano, ¿no? Y luego, claro, ahí hablas de la... Y con esto... y esta es la otra cuestión, hablas de cómo la parodia y la sátira abren hacia una visión, digamos, de lo absoluto, de lo infinito. Y también la locura, digamos, nos libera de lo meramente dado y nos abre a lo infinito y a lo absoluto. Pero claro, a mí me parece que esa interpretación, digamos, ideal, por así decirlo, religiosa de la parodia y la sátira, a mí no me parece tan evidente, porque de alguna manera la parodia y la sátira lo que vienen a mostrar es lo ridículo de la aspiración al infinito, ¿no? El recuerda humano que tienes límites, que eres frágil, que eres una pobre cosa, ¿no? Nos reímos de la grandeza, nos reímos de la aspiración a la grandeza, que hace a una persona que sea ridícula. Entonces, ¿hasta qué punto la parodia y la sátira no es sobre todo una cura de humildad y no tanto una liberación de los límites que nos permite aspirar a lo infinito? Y claro, a la vez la locura como se plantea en el Quijote, es cierto, toda la tradición cristiana, ¿no? de la locura, pero a la vez, por ejemplo, en Erasmo, la locura tampoco parece, ¿no? En el elogio de la locura, es un método satírico, pero tampoco es especialmente laudatoria. O sea, la locura, al final, es una pura crítica, ¿no? Es una pura crítica a los desmanes y excesos de la humanidad, o a la hipocresía de la realidad, ¿no? Y en el Quijote a mí me parece que la locura aparece algo, en último término, risible. Hemos perdido la realidad. O sea, está muy bien el heroísmo, la aspiración a lo grande, pero el gran peligro es perder la realidad. Perder, desconocer lo que la realidad se impone y desconocer los límites entre mi voluntad y la realidad y la alteridad. Y ahí, claro, de alguna manera el Quijote es el que sobrepasa los límites, ¿no? El gran pecado de los griegos, ¿no? La hibris, ¿no? El que olvida el mandato de Delfos de conocerte a ti mismo y nada en demasía, ¿no? ¿Hasta qué punto la locura no es vista sobre todo como un castigo? O sea, como algo realmente un peligro y no tanto como una liberación. Bueno, son muchas cosas, pero tengo más cosas todavía. Y luego podemos hablar de la interpretación de Ortega.
I love listening to you. Really, it's very illuminating to me. And I'll just try then to speak to this final point. Are we going to lose reality, lose touch with reality, with Quixote's impossible quest and this dream? And it's a serious question. There's the question of what is reality? Which reality are we losing, and what are we gaining? One thing that's I think important to keep in mind about Don Quixote, of course, he lives in his dream world, and we see this, and it can be very narcissistic. And yet he doesn't stay on the internet all the time, imbibing messages about the Islamic State or whatever. He confronts, he really goes out to confront the whatever challenges come to him in the world that he doesn't know. And this is his mission as knight errant, just to be available to take on any challenge of whatever. He's always willing to pick a fight with anyone. He puts to the test his illusions. They're always put to the test with an external reality which comes to invade and rupture his bubble. And you bring this up in your comments as well, that there is very much that moment of rupture. It seems to me that reality has to be an open question for us, and to the extent that there is the opening to the other, even the absolute other, represented by Dulcinea, and of course then God is behind this, and in the Christian ideology of the knight errant, he is totally beholden to these higher powers and instances. It's not about him in the end. He is a servant, right? He's just delivering. And there's some beautiful speeches where that really comes out. There's even a beautiful passage that I consider really to be the ontological argument concerning Dulcinea's existence. When the Duchess says, "Now wait a minute, you say you've never even met this woman? How do you know she's not just the figment of your imagination?" Well, the way I argues is, she is so perfect, she has to exist, right? That's the and I am so, such a nullity. I would never be able to create anything so sublime and beautiful as Dulcinea. She has to be real, and that's the ontological argument. And is that real? And it is the ultimate reality of God in negative theology. I think that he is the knight of. And we tend not to be too inclined to believe in that as skeptical moderns. But what I love about the book is the way in which I think it brings it back into reach of skeptical moderns with all of this self-reflexive, self-criticism. And that is the motor for the book itself, Cervantes, and the Ortega's reading especially. And sure, these are two different tendencies, but even the faith of Unamuno is based on a kind of skepticism as well. And he doesn't believe anything that he can prove reasonably. No, reason totally undermines itself. He doesn't believe any of it, and that's the faith, the negative theological faith, I think, that opens up from within the auto-critique, radical, all the way to the bottom of reason. In Unamuno, of course, Ortega is a Cervantista, right, and not a Quixotista. And Unamuno does want to, he sacralizes, right? He's a pilgrim to the sepulcher of Don Quixote, Unamuno. And for Cervantes, as for Ortega, it is really Cervantes' exposure of this character and his anti-heroic, or you said
contraejemplo.
Contraejemplo. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And see, I guess
o antiejemplar, o sea, es antiejemplar.
And and I think that a point, and then we want to open it up, I think. Right?
We have 5 minutes. So,
Is that all?
because, claro, 5:30 es el final del seminario. Yo no sé si quiere alguien hacer alguna pregunta o recogemos 2 preguntas o lo que sea y os parece bien.
Oh, sorry.
Bueno, ya sabes, the limitation time
Yeah.
and space. ¿Alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta o si no, una
Yo
última
muy
palabra?
breve,
Sí, Ana Marta.
Hay un autor español poco conocido, era gallego, escribía en gallego, y tiene un libro espectacular que se llama O segredo del humor, el secreto del humor, dedicado a Cervantes, y el papel del humor en el Quijote como revelador de la realidad y distingue muy bien. Entonces a mí me parece que enlaza directamente con The Revelation of Lazarus, Cervantes Comic Christian News. No sé si...
One point that I didn't really make very clear is how Revelation is parodic, because, and I would say even in the Bible we have to be conscious of the human mediation by language, culture, and all Revelation, I would say, for human beings has to have an element of parody. It's not the divine itself. It's some kind of a distortion in our human terms, and that's what Cervantes, Don Quixote, is really showing us so spectacularly. And please give me the reference for this.
Él se llama Celestino Fernández de la Vera y es cilistro, llamado Libros de 1963. Él fue el traductor de Heidegger al gallego. Pero el libro es extraordinario, está aquí en la biblioteca. Yo pocas veces he leído un ensayo tan lúcido y me parece que
Está en castellano.
En gallego, pero se entiende muy bien. Sí. No, es verdad, en serio, o sea, no, si uno lee en castellano, lee perfecto, lo entiende muy bien. Y yo pienso que es uno de los libros que merecería traducirse a otras lenguas para aportar, porque él se refiere muchas veces a Unamuno y a Ortega también, pero es sobre el humor, ¿no?
¿Podrías repetir el autor y el...?
Celestino Fernández de la Vera,
pero...
Filistro.
Bueno, ¿alguien quiere decir...? Bueno, venga, sí,
Can I ask a last question? I don't know a lot about this. However, I did read, so I have a good example in you know, El Cid, Poema de Mio Cid. There is, I read an edition with a prologue. In the prologue, I don't know who the author of the prologue was, but he said that sometimes, most of the time, I mean all the time, reality is less likely than fiction. In the sense that if you take the life of Mio Cid, for example, the real life of it, it's unbelievable. No one could believe that story. But the fiction, the parody, or the it's way more likely and way more palatable, and maybe because it's we create fiction, and hence fiction is more connatural to us. But I don't know what you.
We can never even perceive reality except through the filters of our fictions. It is too entangled and enigmatic and incomprehensible to us. We only comprehend our own fictions and abstractions. That goes for science as well. These conceptual abstractions and systems. That's the tradition from which Cervantes is working. Deep, and this is the Spanish soul, right? Having been forged really in this deep literary tradition. That's why we read this book as well, because it really does bring that whole past into consciousness. All of the lyric songs and everything from the Romances. This is the richness of Cervantes.
Pues es una pena que tengamos que terminar por la hora, pero bueno, hay que ser disciplinados, así que muchísimas gracias, William, una vez más, y a todos por venir.